Welcome back to the Deep Dive. I'm your host, and
And I'm your expert for today, ready to jump into the sources.
exactly, we've got a fascinating one today. I want to try a little experiment to kick things off. I want you to close your eyes, assuming you weren't driving, of course.
Right, keep your eyes on the road if you're driving.
Definitely. But if you can, imagine doing a bit of cultural time travel with me. Picture a world where the way you plant corn, and I mean the specific physical technique of taking a fire-hardened stick, poking a hole in the dirt, dropping a seed in, and covering it with your foot, hasn't changed in 2,000 years.
It's a really powerful image, honestly. That stick, the digging stick, it's actually still used today in parts of rural Mexico, exactly as it was millennia ago.
Right, so you have this unbelievable stability on the ground level. But in that same world, your entire civilization, the guys running the show, the government, the religion, the massive stone cities, they could be completely wiped off the map in the span of a single decade.
Yeah, it is a striking paradox. You have the deep time of the village going up against the fragile, volatile time of the state.
And that paradox is exactly the landscape we are stepping into today. We are doing a deep dive into excerpts from the parallel traditions of Mesoamerica.
Which is a fascinating source.
It really is. It's a comparative analysis that, honestly, when I first read it, felt a bit like trying to solve a cold case file. We're taking the hard science of Mesoamerican archaeology, so pottery shards, ruins, carbon dating, and overlaying it with the narrative history found in the Book of Mormon.
And before we get too deep into the weeds here, I think it's important to clarify the mission of this deep dive. The source material isn't trying to prove religious faith through science. That's usually a dead end anyway.
Yeah, we aren't here to preach to you today, no sermons.
Exactly. The goal is to explore what the author calls cultural consistency. Think of it as a historical stress test. The question is whether we can match the rise and fall of known civilizations, like the Olmecs and the Maya, with the specific timeline of peoples described in the Book of Mormon.
Specifically, the Jaredites, the Nephites, and the Mulekites.
Right.
We're looking for those aha moments for you. But I do want to push back on that premise a little bit. Are we just talking about vague similarities like, oh, they both built walls? Because that feels a bit like reading horoscopes. You can make it fit anything if you squint hard enough.
That is the danger. Absolutely. But the source argues we are looking for specific idiosyncratic beats, not just, they built walls, but that society collapsed in this specific way at this specific century, followed by a specific type of dark age.
Okay, so we're looking for a fingerprint match, not just a general vibe.
Precisely. And to find that fingerprint, we have to understand the crime scene, so to speak. We have to understand Mesoamerica itself.
Let's unpack that setting. The source calls this a land of paradox. We touched on the corn planting earlier.
Yes, the continuity aspect. The source compares it to the vineyards in Palestine, which remain virtually unchanged from the time of Abraham to the time of Christ. In Mesoamerica, rural life planting, maize, beans, squash, it's the heartbeat. It just keeps beating.
There's what does the author call it? A psychological reluctance to change.
Exactly. A reluctance among the common people that acts as a massive stabilizer.
The more things change, the more they stay the same.
Until they don't. That is the other side of the paradox. Revolution. The sudden, violent collapse. The source uses the Spanish conquest of 1519 as the prime example here. It wasn't a slow transition. It was a cultural decapitation.
It is wild to think about. You have this civilization that developed over, 180 generations, completely isolated from the rest of the world. And then Cortez shows up, and within 2 years, the Aztec capital has fallen.
The conquerors couldn't even believe what they were seeing. Cortez actually wrote to the king of Spain that he couldn't comprehend the reality of Tenochtitlan. It was like a dream to him.
And that brings us to a crucial baseline. Because to understand the parallels the source is arguing for, we have to understand who the Aztecs actually were. When most people think ancient Mexico, they just think Aztec.
Right, they're the poster children for the region, the ones with the massive calendars and the gory human sacrifices. But the source basically calls them, Hicks.
Yeah, I think cultural roughnecks was the nicer way they put it.
Roughnecks is probably accurate. The Aztecs, or the Mexica as they called themselves, were latecomers. They started as nomadic hunters entering the Valley of Mexico around AD 1300. The established cultures already living there considered them rude, uncultured, and barbaric.
But they had a total genius for military organization and terror.
Yes, the terror was foundational to their empire.
The terror part is staggering. The source drops a statistic that honestly made me nauseous. It says that shortly before the Spanish arrived, the Aztecs sacrificed 70,000 victims in a single week. Is that even logistically possible?
It is a highly debated number among historians. But even if you have it, the scale is just industrial. It shows a society totally obsessed with ritual debt and blood. But here is the fascinating technological disconnect the source points out.
The lack of tech, right?
Yes. Despite that power, despite the terror, they had no draft animals, no cows, no horses. They didn't have the plow, and they didn't even have the wheel for transport.
Which seems impossible for an empire of that size.
Yeah.
How do you move 70,000 people to sacrifice them without wheels?
On foot. Everything was human-powered. It sets a very specific constraint on how far their power could project. But here is the pivot point for our discussion today. The source argues that the Aztecs are actually the end of the story. They are the leftovers of something much bigger.
So to understand the Book of Mormon connections, we have to look before the Aztecs.
Exactly. We have to look at what the source calls the two traditions.
Okay, the two traditions.
Yeah.
Define that for me. Are we talking about two different groups of people?
Think of them as two massive waves of civilization, separated by a sort of dark age in between. Tradition 1 is the first great wave, the formative period. Tradition 2 is the second wave, the classic period.
And the source argues these align perfectly with the two main civilizations in the Book of Mormon.
They do.
All right, let's ride the first wave. Tradition 1. This is the Olmecs.
Roughly 1500 BC to 600 BC.
These are the guys famous for those giant stone heads, right? I've seen pictures. They look like linebackers wearing football helmets.
They really do.
Yeah.
And the scale is hard to convey until you stand next to one. Some of these heads weigh 20 tons. They're carved from volcanic basalt, which means they had to drag these massive stones through swamps and jungles.
Again, without wheels.
Without wheels. This was a sophisticated, high-functioning culture centered around the Isthmus of Tehuantepec.
And the source aligns this Tradition 1 directly with the Jaredites from the Book of Mormon. So let's look at the timeline there. The Jaredites leave the Great Tower, which most interpret as the Tower of Babel.
Historically, we know that Mesopotamian ziggurats, those great towers, date to before 3000 BC. So the starting gun for the Jaredites aligns with the rise of urbanization in the Near East. But the connection gets much more controversial and specific when we talk about how they got to the Americas.
The transoceanic theory. This is the stuff that usually gets archaeologists fighting in bars. The source brings up diffusionism. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. In archaeology, there's a massive debate. If you see a pyramid in Egypt and a pyramid in Mexico, did one group cross an ocean and teach the other? That's diffusionism. Or did both groups just figure out on their own that a triangle is a stable shape to build with? That's independent invention.
And the source is team diffusion.
In this specific case, yes. It cites the work of archaeologists Betty Meggers and Clifford Evans regarding pottery. Now, pottery might seem boring, but it's the DNA of archaeology.
It survives when everything else rots.
Exactly. They found pottery in Valdivia, Ecuador, dating to roughly 3000 BC. And when they analyzed it, the incised decorations, the rim shapes, the specific finger-wiping techniques inside the bowl, they found it was indistinguishable from Jomon pottery found in Kyushu, Japan, from the exact same period.
Indistinguishable. That's a huge claim. Are we talking looks kind of similar or like a forensic match?
Meggers and Evans argued it was so specific it couldn't possibly be a coincidence. They proposed that a boat of Jomon fishermen got caught in a storm, drifted, and ended up in Ecuador.
Okay, but Japan to Ecuador, that's the entire Pacific Ocean.
It is, but that brings us to the oceanography. The Black Stream, or Japan Current, sweeps up past Japan, across the North Pacific near the Aleutians, and down the California coast. It's a literal conveyor belt in the ocean.
And how long does that take?
Meggers and Evans estimated a drift voyage on that current would take about a year.
Use that number. A year.
Right. Now look at the Book of Mormon text. The Jaredites build barges, which implies a drift voyage, not sailing with sails, and the text explicitly says they were on the water for 344 days.
Which is roughly a year.
It's almost an exact match. You have a theoretical scientific estimate for a Pacific drift crossing, and a scriptural record published in 1830 that gives a number entirely consistent with that modern estimate.
That is a weirdly specific correlation. Okay, so let's say they land. Geography-wise, where do they set up shop?
The Book of Mormon describes the Jaredites living primarily in the land northward. Now, for a long time, readers just assumed that meant North America. But the source argues that in the internal geography of the text, the land northward refers to the area north of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. that narrow neck of land in Mexico.
And archaeologically speaking,
That is exactly where the Olmec settlements were concentrated. The overlap is geographical as well as chronological.
but then, like all good empires, the lights go out. The Olmecs didn't just slowly fade away into the jungle, they crashed.
Violently. The site of San Lorenzo, one of the premier Olmec cities, wasn't just abandoned, it was destroyed. The statues, those 20-ton basalt heads, were deliberately defaced, pockmarked, buried in long lines. It strongly suggests a massive internal revolt or a civil war.
And the timeline for this crash,
This collapse happens right around 600 BC.
which aligns perfectly with the end of the Book of Ether, where the Jaredites basically exterminate each other in a massive civil war.
Correct. The peak of the civilization and the sudden collapse align perfectly in both records.
Okay, so tradition 1 is over, the Olmecs are gone, the Jaredites are gone, and that leaves a massive vacuum in Mesoamerica.
A power vacuum. And this brings us to the most overlooked part of the puzzle. The source calls it the leftovers, or the half-tradition.
I feel like half-tradition is just a polite academic way of saying the Dark Ages.
Essentially, yes. After the Olmec fall, post-600 BC, you don't have a unifying empire in that region anymore. You have fragmented local cultures, scuffling chiefs. There's no major power structure and no high art being produced. Sites like Cuicuilco and early Monte Alban show a real fragmentation.
And this is exactly when the Molochites show up in the Book of Mormon narrative.
Yes, the people of Zarahemla. They arrive around 586 BC, right after the destruction of Jerusalem in the Old World. But here is the key, and it addresses your earlier skepticism about making things fit just because we want them to. The Book of Mormon explicitly says the Molochites didn't bring any records with them.
So they were illiterate.
Or they became so very quickly. The text says their language had become corrupted and they denied their creator. They entirely lost their history.
So archaeologically, if you're looking for a group of people who arrived around 586 BC, you shouldn't be looking for glorious temples and massive libraries of stone.
Exactly. You should be looking for nothing. Or rather, you should be looking for a cultural dip. A group living in the ruins of a greater past. Illiterate and highly localized. The negative evidence of the archaeology matches the cultural poverty described in the text.
That's a really interesting point. Usually you want to find the golden plates or the big neon sign that says Mulek was here. But the source is saying the lack of evidence is actually the evidence we should expect.
In this specific context, yes. And then the narrative changes again. The Molochites get absorbed by the Nephites. And around 100 BC, Mesoamerica shifts gears again. We enter tradition 2.
The rise of the theocratic state. This is the classic period.
This is where we start seeing the really fancy stuff emerge again. We shift from these fragmented, scuffling cultures to a deep obsession with priesthood, elaborate rituals, calendars, and intense social stratification.
The source focuses on 2 key archaeological sites here, Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico and Camonaljuyu in Guatemala.
Camonaljuyu is crucial to this argument. It's located in the Guatemalan highlands. The source identifies this area as the land of Nephi, and Teotihuacan and the Central Chiapas Depression are identified with the land of Zarahemla.
Okay, let's talk about the society itself, because the Book of Mormon talks a lot about kings and classes and priests during this specific time. It paints a picture of a very structured, very unequal society. Does the archaeology back that up, or was everyone holding hands and sharing the corn?
It was definitely not holding hands. It was grim. Let's look at Mound E33 at Camonaljuyu.
Catchy name. Describe it for us. What are we actually looking at?
It's a massive earthen pyramid, about 70 feet high. It's essentially a giant tomb complex. And inside, archaeologists found the main crypt. It was lined with incredible wealth jade, stingray spines used for bloodletting rituals, fine pottery. But the most telling discovery was the other bodies.
Other bodies.
Yes. The skeletons of servants. Women and children who had been sacrificed to accompany the ruler into the afterlife.
That implies a terrifying level of power. You aren't just the boss. You literally own these people's lives.
Exactly. It indicates a society with immense, rigid power differentials. You have kings or high priests who are legally and spiritually superior to the commoner.
And if we look at the Book of Mormon narrative,
You have accounts of Lamanite kings who had absolute power over servants. The text specifically mentions sepulchres tombs in the Book of Alma. The social stratification matches beautifully, but there is another layer to this that I find really compelling.
the pride cycle.
Yes, the source draws a direct line here. Archaeologically, around AD 200, we see this massive rise in wealth and class distinction. It's the absolute peak of the classic period.
And in the Book of Mormon, specifically in 4th Nephi, that is exactly when the utopian society breaks down. They start wearing costly apparel, they stop having things in common, and they divide into rigid classes.
It's almost a one-to-one mapping. The archaeological record shows a golden age where wealth explodes, and the scriptural record describes that exact wealth leading to a moral and social fracture.
So you have a society that is getting richer, more unequal, and deeply obsessed with status. Usually in history, that's a recipe for disaster.
It always is, and this leads us to the final act, collapse and militarism.
The bubble bursts.
Around AD 300 to 400, the mood in Mesoamerica changes, and it gets much darker. Teotihuacan, which had grown to a massive city of 100,000 people, suddenly stops building public works. The energy shifts from building temples to building walls. We see the rapid rise of militarism.
So we go from peaceful theocracies, or at least highly organized religious states, to war zones.
The archaeology shows a definite shift to war-torn states, and this correlates perfectly with the end of the Nephite narrative.
The source points out something really specific about burning here, right?
Yes, it does. Around AD 350, major structures in Chiapas, specifically at a site called Mirador, Mound 10, were burned and abandoned. Not just left to decay, but intentionally scorched.
And AD 350 is right in the pocket of when the Nephites are being driven out of their lands in the narrative. They're retreating northward, losing cities to fire and war.
It is, but it gets even darker. The source talks about barbarization. We start finding physical evidence of cannibalism near Teotihuacan around AD 450. And in Maya art from this period, we see new, brutal motifs. We see the treading of victors on captives.
Treading on captives, that sounds awful.
It means physically stomping on them, humiliating them before sacrifice.
That reminds me, doesn't the Book of Mormon get incredibly dark right at the end? I remember reading Moroni 9, and it wasn't uplifting Sunday school material, it was butchery.
It is horrific to read. Moroni 9 details the complete breakdown of social order. It describes ritual murders, cannibalism, specifically feeding the flesh of captives to others, and the total, brutal extermination of the Nephite nation.
So the text describes a descent into absolute barbarism.
And the archaeological record confirms that the peaceful classic period dissolved into a nightmare of militarism and ritual violence.
And the aftermath of all this blood.
The half-tradition returns. After AD 600, society becomes purely secular and militaristic. This paves the way for groups like the Toltecs and eventually our friends the Aztecs. Religion stops being the center of life and becomes merely a tool for political terror.
So if we zoom out and look at the big picture of what we've covered today, the source is essentially arguing that the Book of Mormon isn't just a book of theology. It's presented as a cultural history.
That is the core argument the author is making. They are saying, look, if this book was just made up by a farm boy in 1830s New York, he shouldn't have known about the drift currents of the Pacific Ocean. He shouldn't have known that a high civilization collapsed around 600 BC, followed by a dark age, followed by another rise in stratigraphy and wealth around AD 200.
It's the rhythm of it all. The heartbeat matches.
Precisely. The peaks of the narrative match the peaks of the archaeology, and the valleys match the valleys.
So why does this matter? Aside from being a really fascinating comparative analysis, why should you, the listener, care?
The source argues it's fundamentally about identity. For modern indigenous peoples, these ruins are often presented as just mysteries, exotic tourist traps. But if this connection holds, it links the real past, the hard archaeology, with a real heritage.
It turns the stones into ancestors.
Exactly. It gives the ruins a voice and a continuous narrative.
And it suggests that history is cyclical. That's the part that really sticks with me. We started with the corn, that deep continuity, but the story we just told is one of rising, peaking, and burning to the ground.
The archaeological record of Mesoamerica screams one lesson above all others. Civilization is fragile. The Olmecs thought they would last forever. They carved 20-ton basalt heads to prove it to the future. The classic Maya thought they would last forever.
And they both ended up burned and buried in the jungle.
It raises a very uncomfortable question for us today, doesn't it?
It does. If history is a cycle, are we currently living in a tradition that is peaking? Or are we on the verge of our own Mound 10 burning? And here's a thought to leave you with. Think about the physical footprint we are leaving behind. The Olmecs left 20-ton stone heads. We store our entire civilization's memory in the cloud, on delicate silicon chips and servers that require constant electricity. If our tradition burns, we might not even leave enough behind for a half-tradition.
We might not leave anything for the next cycle to find it all.
Definitely something to mull over next time you back up your phone.
A sobering thought.
That's all for today's deep dive into the parallel traditions of Mesoamerica. Thanks for joining us on this trip through time.
Keep exploring the sources.
We'll catch you on the next one.